All right, greetings everybody. Welcome back to my continued series. My name is Eric Tolman, and this is part of a 19th century European history series that I've been doing. This is technically part two. The first one is titled, I believe, Towards Enlightenment, the Modern Age Towards Enlightenment. So if you're watching them in order, you'd watch this one second, and then from there you'd move into the causes of the French Revolution. So the Enlightenment. Boy, what a huge topic and what a tremendous impact this intellectual movement has on the future of France and the 13 colonies, both of which would fall to revolution, the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789. It's fair to say that both those revolutions were children, if you will, of the Enlightenment. You had tremendous contributions from both France and Great Britain that would really kind of pave the way for people applying many of the ideas that had been developed up to that point in intellectual thought. The big three that stand out for me, and the ones that I go into great length in my first lecture, the one entitled Towards Enlightenment, is I talk about Renaissance humanism, and then I talk about deism, and lastly I talk about empiricism. What those three movements really come to the conclusion, if I can encapsulate those three, because I don't want to go into them now because I do in my previous lecture, is the idea basically, if you start at humanism, the idea that we are going to focus on what humans are capable of. That the human experience, what human exploration can do. God has given us the ability to think and reason, therefore we should use it. Is a nutshell of what the humanists believed. Of course, they were also harking back to ancient Roman Greece, and they were sort of skirting and criticizing what was called, scholasticism, medieval scholasticism, which is sort of the bulwark, if you will, of what was taught at universities in medieval Europe. Here's the explanation for everything you need to know. You just need to know this stuff, and you don't need to question anything beyond that. The humanists wanted to move beyond the idea of having everything explained for them, and they believed that the human mind was able to do its own exploration, and hence you had this incredible flowering in the arts and in literature and political theory, because people were saying we have the ability to think and reason, therefore we should use it. The deists are kind of on the same track as the humanists. They essentially were saying that, God is the great creator, and he does not interfere in the human world, which means that he's created all the pieces of the puzzle and he's sort of left them scattered about, and as a result we need to kind of take those pieces and put them together. And then once again, that's a very simplified version of deism. When we get to empiricism is more the idea that we come to understand things by observing them. If we can't see it, or we can't reason it with our own eyes, then we don't have to believe it. A lot of empiricism, of course, was born out of the age of the scientific revolution. So what you see is this movement towards human advancements without necessarily either religious explanations or something connected to God being the great puppet master, if you will. God created us, and he has created brains and given us the ability to think and reason. So out of that comes the idea that if we can have rational explanations for the natural world or with the stars and the solar system, why can't we have a rational view on government, on how government should operate? So the Enlightenment is very much a child of those general movements, if you will. And out of that, you begin to see people who are investigating ways in which they can be governed, or ways society can be governed. Because you have to think that before the Enlightenment, the vast majority of Europe was ruled by monarchs who believed that they were kings or queens by a divine right. And that was the only explanation people needed to know. So what the Enlightenment does is it comes along and it says, no, this is how society can be developed. It can be developed on reason, on logic, human experience and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very, at the time, it would have been very, very revolutionary. So, all right, we'll start at science, the impact. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Copernicus, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton established a structured, orderly, and rational vision free of divine authority. Okay. Now we should note too that when Copernicus, Kepler, many, many more decided to investigate the solar system and come up with ideas of how the Earth revolved or where the Sun revolved, and did the Sun revolve around the Earth or was it the other way around, they realized that they could look at this sky night after night after night and see changes and track those changes. And as a result of their observations, the result of their empirical understanding of the universe, they could come to rational, logical conclusions based on what they see. So, the Age of Reason determined that natural law could be applied to the organization of society and improve the political, economic, and social structures of Europe. All right, here's what I was talking about earlier, the idea that you can use those basic principles of logic and reason and nature, if you will, and apply it to the structure of human societies, right? Nothing revolutionary, but I mean, from our perspective, certainly it isn't revolutionary because to us, this is logical. This is how the development of democratic societies have evolved. But at the time, it would have been considered quite revolutionary. By the 18th century, Europe saw growth in towns and cities, including an increase in professionals, I'll explain that shortly, improvements in transportation and commerce, and greater awareness of health and improvements in agriculture. Right around this time, of course, we'll talk another time about the agricultural and the industrial revolutions, and those would be major game changers for society as well. So what you see happening is that we are moving towards the modern age in technology, in human reason, in how we understand the function of government, and how we understand how government should operate, right? And what is the responsibility, if you will, of a government. You begin to see greater political power also for people who are either skilled tradespeoples or professionals, doctors, lawyers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, bakers, whatever you want to call it. These are people that, you know, are hardworking, that have a skill, that are providing a service, that are contributing to the economy, and so on and so forth. And they begin to feel naturally that they should have a voice, and that that government should not necessarily interfere in how they operate. Now, certainly the absolutists didn't necessarily interfere in that group, but there is developing certainly a tug and pull in terms of, well, what are my rights and limitations within my king's lands, and so on and so forth. So there are shifts and changes occurring. Now, the middle skilled tradespeople classes aside, peasant life was still extremely difficult. It's hard for us to imagine today, but we have to think of peasant life as the most basic form, if you will, of human existence. These people's lives were very much regulated by the seasons. That's why they had harvest festivals or, you know, harvest celebrations, because, oh my gosh, thank God, it rained enough, everything grew. We were able to harvest what we needed, we could feed ourselves, and we could sell our surpluses in the market and help us get us through the winter. The seasons were a life and death struggle for these people. If it did not rain and their crops did not grow, they would simply starve. There were so many challenges, even the winters could be brutal if they didn't have enough food getting through the winter. So there was a tremendous amount of challenges that these people were facing. And despite progress, peasants, as I said, were deprived of literacy and completely unaware of social and enlightened developments. So when we talk about social movements, or rather political or intellectual movements like humanism or the Enlightenment, the peasant classes of Europe are completely unaware of what is going on. They are so driven by the immediacy of their lives. They can't read. And you have to understand too that these people tended to be very, very religious and very, very superstitious because, you know, they were susceptible to believing everything they were told, particularly by people in their community who were in positions of authority. And in their cases, that would of course be the church for the most part, that's where they went for moral guidance, that's where they went for spiritual guidance. And you know, oftentimes when they go to church, a lot of the old, like pre-Reformation, these ministers were preaching in Latin, so they couldn't even understand what the heck they were saying. But you know, they really thought that if it didn't rain, you know, maybe that was God punishing them, so they would go seek salvation in the church. And you know, so they could be very superstitious and extremely hardworking. But like I say, their lives were very much regulated by the seasons. Daily life kept most distracted, where they faced life and death struggles against the environment, droughts, crop failures, and famine, which were common. You know, a lot of people don't understand that the reason that agrarian families had large families, lots of kids, was to have more hands on deck, if you will. But it was also with the recognition that there was a high percentage that many of your children would die before they hit their teen years. I mean, peasants didn't understand disease. They thought disease was an act of God, once again, punishment, right? So they couldn't understand, you know, what on earth was happening to them when people would get sick. There wasn't the medicine, there wasn't the understanding of what was happening to them when they got sick. Just cleanliness alone. I mean, these people didn't necessarily bathe on a regular basis. They certainly didn't brush their teeth. Which is why all the cliches when you watch old, you know, films about people in late medieval Europe or this period, their teeth were always intentionally blackened to show they didn't brush their teeth, and when they had a toothache, you know, or they needed a tooth removed, that was a rather unpleasant exercise as well. So, lots of challenges. Here we go. Most of them own 2 sets of clothes, washed maybe 3 times per year. Okay, I can only imagine. Vegetable soup, eggs, cheese, and heavy rye or oat bread were staples. So their diet, when the seasons were working properly, that is when it rained appropriately, when things grew, when there's enough sunshine and so on and so forth, when things grew and their animals on their farms were healthy, they had a very hearty and for the most part a healthy, balanced diet. Families were mostly close-knit because they so desperately depended on each other. But violence and brutal behavior was common, usually encouraged by alcohol, which provided a reprieve from hardships. Alcoholism has been a problem in human societies for thousands of years, and it's only really been within the last 50, 60 years where we've really addressed the dangers of alcohol. You know, I mean, you could go back to the early Aboriginal experience in Canada, the first peoples in Canada and the U.S. who were you know, sold alcohol when they were trading furs, and they didn't understand what the heck it was they were drinking. They just knew that it made them feel very, very different. And so they were extremely susceptible to alcoholism because their immune systems weren't used to managing alcohol. You know, the first real group of people that really began to recognize that alcohol was a major problem was the women's temperance movement. And we'll come back and look at the women's temperance movement another time. And they're the ones that really pushed forward the idea of the banning of alcohol after World War I in the United States. And so, you know, alcoholism has been a problem for hundreds of thousands of years. In these days, you know, life was so hard, you know, it was very easy for people to succumb to this, particularly the males. Very rarely the women of the families tended to be very protective, and oftentimes the women, the wives and on the farm, are protecting themselves and their children from their father, who oftentimes can come home drunk and be abusive and so on and so forth. And it seems like a cliche, but unfortunately alcohol ravaged these communities because of the tremendous hardships that people faced at the time. Peasants tended to be fiercely religious and superstitious, hoping for a better afterlife. You know, and the irony is they would go to church to seek salvation and seek guidance. And they firmly believed, and not without good reason, I mean, the church had been a big part of European society for generations, but the understanding that, you know, life might be super, super hard right now and people are going to die and we're going to suffer, but when we die, we are going to be rewarded in the kingdom of heaven. So, you know, I mean, because their lives were so difficult, I think it made them all the more hopeful for what would come once they, you know, their lives were finished in the mortal world, if you will. Well, the nobility lived a life of excess in dress, food, entertainment, and housing. So what a complete contrast of life that these people lived at the time. Elaborate dress was largely impractical, and women required a maid to fit her dress properly. You know, when you look at the dresses that women wore, the way they had their hair done, this, if they were going out for dinner, this was an all-day affair. I mean, and it required someone to do it for you, to cinch you up in the back. I mean, I can't imagine what the heck you do if you had to go to the bathroom in these dark dresses. I mean, hopefully they were able to make them in such a way that that wasn't too difficult, but you know, it really was a tremendous effort just to get dressed for dinner. So, manners were central, and of course Louis XIV, the Sun King, we'll talk about later, that was his big thing, you know, manners and the ballet and all those things. Manners were central to court culture, and the minuet dance was elegant and ritualistic. Upper classes were free from traditional religious teachings regarding behavior, and adultery was common. I mean, the hedonism in these circles was quite remarkable. Just the, you know, being exposed to so much opulence, to have access to servants, to clothing, to warmth, to all your needs were always met all the time. It resulted in a very sort of hedonistic lifestyle, which was, you know, in adultery was commonplace during this time. Moral codes were largely abandoned and hedonism took precedent. These people didn't feel that they really needed to seek salvation as much. They tended to be a lot less superstitious. I mean, people were religious oftentimes in sort of an obligatory sense, and I don't mean to disdain religion, but just the idea that they kind of had everything they needed. They didn't necessarily want it to be, they didn't want to be bound by some of the codes of religious expectations, because they were living a very unpious life, if you will. So, all right, let's look at some of the philosophers. So Isaac Newton's application of mathematics to the material world revealed an orderly and predictable universal structure. Okay, and this is where even people like Sir Francis Bacon, the scientific method, the idea that we can trace the steps of progress through a series of steps, and that things can be logical, things can be orderly. Certainly the scientific revolution, and particularly the astronomers, really perpetuated this idea of an orderly society based on observation and reason and so on and so forth. So out of that comes, as I said earlier, the idea that we could begin to look at society in general as an orderly, to have an orderly structure, if you will. Could reason and order not then be applied, sorry, typo there, could not then be applied to politics, society, and even religion? Okay, that's the big question of the early Enlightened thinkers. John Locke would go further. Here's Locke here. By stating that human nature was good and possessed natural rights such as liberty, the right to property, and the right to life. I would say of all the Enlightened thinkers, John Locke and certainly Adam Smith, we'll talk about later, probably the two biggest in the American Declaration of Rights, in the American Declaration of Independence rather, confuse that sometimes with the French Declaration of Rights and of Man and Citizen. But you can really see a lot of his words right out of the Declaration of Independence. So the idea that human nature was good, that humans should be protected by certain rights, and you know, protected from tyranny. Certainly that would have been the bedrock of the Declaration of Independence in the United States, having won a 7-year struggle against the British. In his social contract, Locke felt that government holds power by permission of its citizens, so long as they serve in the best interests of the people. Okay. Well, what about the monarchies? The monarchies think that they are in power by divine right. But Locke says, no, 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 that's all fine and good, but still the government has a responsibility to govern responsibly, that you should be in charge by consent of the people, not the other way around, right? So, as a result, selfish and irresponsible government could then be legitimately overthrown. If the people in a nation felt that their government was irresponsible or not adequate to the needs of the people, in the case of some absolutist monarchs in Europe at the time, then they could legitimately be thrown out. If they're not willing to cooperate or not willing to succumb to the needs of the people based on how the people interpret that, then they rightfully can be thrown out of office. Okay, Locke went further. Some very interesting analysis from him. He suggested we are a blank slate at birth, and our sensory perceptions as we grow up shape who we become. Now some of you might be thinking right away, what does that have to do with the Enlightenment? Well, it has quite a bit to do with it. Because if you think about it, what makes us a good citizen? Are we innately good, or do we learn to be good? That's what he was arguing, that who we become as human beings is based on our experience with our parents, with our teachers, with our community, that everyone that we have a relationship in as we grow up has an impact on us. And if all those relationships are generally positive, then we will grow up being a positive person. If we grow up in a abusive relationship or abused by our parents and you know, abused by our priest or so on and so forth, that is going to tarnish our ability to be a good person. So it was the recognition that who we are is based on our sensory experience throughout our life, right? So it has certainly its logic. The child's ideas would develop into complex ideas through reason and natural order. Okay, this is where this is important. So if a child is exposed to education, if a child learns to read, if a child learns about compassion and empathy and love and all those things, because while some of those qualities can be to some degree innate, we all want to be loved, we all want to be empathetic for the most part, but if we grow up in a culture of abuse, then we're only going to know what we've experienced, and therefore the abused becomes the abuser. We know the whole story. So I think in many ways this is a very, very perceptive view of human nature, about what shapes us, about how we become good citizens. And you know, and I think it is very, very relevant to understanding you can't have good government unless it's run by good citizens, right? Tyrannical government is often run by tyrannical individuals, you know. So, you know, I think it's an important point, for sure. Morality and right and wrong are learned, not innate. Okay, so in other words, society, in Locke's view, has a moral responsibility to raise children and citizens that are going to be good citizens, right? We want people to contribute. We want people to obey the law. We want people to achieve their goals by being allowed to explore their talents, you know, and their abilities, whether it be through education, whether it be through a skilled trade, all those things, because all those people in the jobs that they do contribute to a productive modern society. God's divine laws could be discovered by reason, and Christian morality would keep people happy and in check. So you have that balance. God's divinity, God's guidance keeps us all honest, keeps us all good, hopefully. So, you know, religion does have a place in society, and, you know, it's a real misconception to think that the enlightened thinkers were anti-clerical or they were anti-religious. They really weren't thinking that way originally. It was more that we do have the ability to shape our own universe. We have the ability to shape our own futures as human beings, and therefore we need to take the bull by the horns and move forward. And we need to build a society based on morality, based on empathy, based on democracy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all those things. So it gets very, very exciting when people begin to make those connections of how a society could be developed. What becomes even more exciting is when people like John Locke begin to realize that there are people in France like Voltaire and Montesquieu and others that are kind of saying the same kind of thing. They're coming at it from a different angle. But boy, what an inspiration when all these people begin to realize that they're kind of on the same page and where societies should be going. The 17th century ideas of Newton and Locke would greatly influence the French philosophers we would say in English, philosophers of the 18th century. So once again, the British at the forefront of opening the door to this intellectual movement that we come to know as the Enlightenment, and it really flourishes in France. And I think the reason it flourishes so much in France is because they were still far behind in terms of the structure of their society. They were still an absolute monarchy. Great Britain had already begun to move towards constitutionalism. So I think there was a great deal more repression and a great deal more backwardness in France as there was in Great Britain at this time. All right, so while the English dominated innovations in science and culture in the 17th century, the 18th century belonged to the French. What's interesting, is that when I studied the Enlightenment many years ago now in university, I remember reading Montesquieu and Rousseau and Diderot and Voltaire. And of course, I was reading translations of those primary works. And anytime anything is translated from one language to another, you kind of lose something in that translation. I often say to my students, I really wish I could have been more fluent in French because I would love to have read these original works in French. In my classes, in my English classes, one of my favorites to teach is All Quiet on the Western Front. And my students love the book. It's one of the great anti-war novels ever written, but the original is in German. And I can only imagine how great that book would be in its original language. Even in translation, it's a remarkable piece of work. So, translation is an interesting thing. The writings of the French philosophers challenged accepted views of religion, government, economics, and the very nature of humanity. So, wow, very revolutionary. Writing became an accepted profession, and these ideas were discussed in clubs or salons. So you can only imagine that when these individuals met each other, maybe it was usually at a dinner, or there would be a host at a salon, would be hosting an evening of discussion, And when we talk about the salons, as a kid, I thought a salon in the 70s was where your mom went and had one of those big plastic dryers put on her head, and she smoked cigarettes, had a coffee, and read a newspaper. To me, that was a salon. But in the days of the Enlightenment, a salon was usually like almost like a library, a big open space owned by a wealthy aristocrat who would invite people like Voltaire and Montesquieu and Rousseau to, hey, come on over, guys. We want you to talk, and we want to share your ideas. We want you to share your ideas with others. And the salons became very, very dynamic, because from my understanding, it's one thing to have ideas in your head and to articulate those thoughts and ideas onto paper. That's one process, but I think the most important process is that once you have a discourse with other people that are thinking the same kinds of things, that back and forth, that discussion is what really sees this blossoming, because it really emboldens these enlightened thinkers, because now they realize that this is more than just their ideas. There's a movement out there of thinkers who share the same ideas, who have at the end, despite the different means, at the same end is to produce a better society that is fair and equal and all those kind of things. So the salons, I think it can't be understated how important salon culture was, and we'll talk about that a little later as well. Driven by the professional classes and enlightened aristocrats, these ideas turned the most dynamic social group in France into hostile critics of the monarchy, the church, and authority of any sort. So everywhere in French society you could see injustice, not just for the peasants, not just for the skilled tradespeople, but also for the aristocrats who, while they lived this sort of opulent lifestyle, there were people within the noble classes or the aristocrat classes that were enlightened, if you will, that were curious and interested in the ideas of of democracy, of liberty. So, you know, once you get people in positions of influence that are supporting these ideas, that's when you really begin to see movement. But most importantly, of course, is the idea that now that you've got the invention of the printing press, and the printing press had been active for 100, 200 years since Gutenberg's invention, you can get these ideas out there, right? And the more books you have out there, the greater the appeal is of literacy. So the more access to books, the more access to reading, and the more people that are learning to read as well. So, okay, so, all right, so this, Diderot's Encyclopedia, wow, very revolutionary, because what Diderot does is he says, man, there's so much great stuff floating around in intellectual thought. I want to put all that stuff together. I want to put it all in one place. I mean, you could go buy Voltaire by Candide, or you could buy The Social Contract by Rousseau, you know, as a single novel or a single work. But Diderot says, let's put them all in one place. And then that way people can buy the encyclopedias and they'll have access to all these enlightened thinkers and all these enlightened ideas. By 1775, it had grown to 28 massive volumes, which compiled the most famous philosophers of the day, including, but not entirely, well, there's many, many more, I guess is what I'm trying to say, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. To me, they're really the big, big three in France at the time. Diderot suffered continual attacks by both church and government officials, and despite this, 25,000 sets were sold, with half sold outside of France. Interesting that both the government and also the established churches were very, very hostile to the idea of people reading this stuff. Well, probably because they were well aware that potentially people that are emboldened with these enlightened ideas, that it could potentially sacrifice and compromise their own existence, because much of what they were preaching was kind of the complete opposite political structure in which they lived, particularly in absolutist France. Catherine the Great of Russia would be one of the enlightened despots, I think is a term we often see used, who prided herself on intellectual pursuits, bought a set of Diderot's Encyclopedia, as did Frederick the Great of Prussia. Now these things could also be translated, but we have to consider too, France was the language of diplomacy in Europe at the time, so, I mean, you know, Catherine the Great, now I don't know for sure, I'd have to do the research, but I would imagine that both Frederick and both Catherine could speak French anyway, so they may very well have had a untranslated, a French version of the encyclopedia. But, you know, Voltaire spent a lot of time with Catherine the Great. He'd go over to Russia, and she just loved it. She loved talking about these ideas, and, you know, you got to consider that most monarchs, despite the fact that they're, you know, reactionary in terms of progress, if you will, political progress, they're very, very bright. They're well educated. They've been exposed to the best tutors and the best teachers. They're well read, and they're probably very much inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, but they certainly are not willing to implement these kinds of ideas in their society. Doesn't mean they're not interested in talking about it. All right, well, France was the cultural capital of Europe, and French was designated the language of diplomacy. There we go. French food, culture, customs, and architecture were emulated in upper-class Europe. I was in France just 2 years ago when I took my family to Vimy on the just after the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. We spent time in Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and you know, we used to just love going to the grocery store and buying a big long French bread, a brick of cheese, some meat, and a bottle of red wine, and some pop for the kids, and that was a staple. It just felt good eating that way in France. But there's many other things, of course, than just cheese and French bread. But certainly there was no lack of great food in Europe at the time, and particularly in France. With a population of 22 million before the Revolution, France was the most populous nation in Europe. Writings in France were dominated by Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, who were literary geniuses who argued for improved social structures, but differed on the nature of the solution. They all complemented each other. They were all coming from different angles, but when you put them all together, you get quite a complete picture of how society could be better. And you know, even one on their own is a fascinating study, but when they all are read collectively, you get quite a, you can understand that those who drove the French Revolution, the intellectuals anyway who did, had a lot of ideas floating around in terms of how they could develop their society. Montesquieu was a lawyer from Bordeaux who traveled extensively studying political and social institutions. While in England, he studied Locke and marveled at the workings of the English Parliament. You know, Great Britain for the French Philosophers was a tremendous inspiration because they had already moved towards a type of constitutional democracy. So there was already that significant shift. And not only were they at the forefront of intellectual thought, but later they would be at the forefront of the industrial, the agricultural revolutions, and later technology and well, certainly the industrial revolution. But you know, it almost seemed like, from intellectual perspective, it starts in Great Britain. You know, and the further east you get, the more delayed they are in economic, social, and political development. That's not to say that there's anything innate, you know, with Central or Eastern Europeans. It's just that was just the way that these ideas developed. So, you know, England, of course, was that model, and there's no question that Voltaire and Rousseau would have been inspired by what was happening there. In 1748, his Spirit of the Laws argued that republics require the separation of powers, which maintain checks and balances. I'm just going to close my door. You can hear my dog. One sec. There we go. Lots of background noise here. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws argued that republics require the separation of powers, which maintain checks and balances. Boy, such a simple thing to understand in a democracy, but revolutionary at the time. What he says is that in order to keep the power, in this case of the monarch, in check, you need to have levels of government. In, you know, whether it be federal, state, provincial, and then municipal. Or from a legal perspective, the legislative, the judiciary, you know, those kinds of things. Just different levels of government, each of which have a certain responsibility. In the case of my experience, I have my municipal government, which is my local government that deals with garbage, deals with recycling, deals with property taxes and things like that. The provincial government is responsible for certain things, and then the federal government is responsible for other things. So each of those levels have a certain responsibility to the citizens of Canada, in this case. Same kind of system in the States as well. So you need to have these separation of powers. Executive, here we go, legislative and judicial levels of government would be an example of these levels. And they would reduce despotism of absolute rulers, and his ideas were best exemplified by the American model. So the American revolutionaries would, you know, they would be inspired by the ideas of Locke and Newton and Adam Smith, of course, in terms of how their societies would work in terms of finance, if you will. When we get to Adam Smith, we'll talk about what his ideas were. But where Montesquieu comes in is he says, this is how your society can be structured. You know, you do need a structure. You have so many variables when you organize a society. You know, when you have a revolution, you got to build from the bottom up, and especially if you're overtaking an absolutist government where there's really very little to nothing in place of a structure of government. Montesquieu lays the framework of how that could work. Voltaire was considered the best critic of French society and the leading exponent of reason in government. So definitely one of, you know, he had that literary advantage too, that he was a great storyteller, and oftentimes something like Candide, for example, was really kind of an allegory of the ineptitude of the French monarchy, and he was very, very good at that. He was very clever, very funny, but he could also make a very, very strong statement in the process. At various times he was imprisoned or exiled due to his sharp criticism of the aristocracy and government. I mean, he himself was an aristocrat, but he couldn't help but be sickened by some of the habits and the attitudes of some of these people who just lived for the sake of living and didn't really care about other people and were hedonistic and drank too much and were adulterers and all these things, and he just thought it was immoral and completely pointless. So, there were those enlightened aristocrats like Voltaire who would have been very, very critical of aristocratic life. During exile in England, he studies Newton and Locke, and his primary focus was individual liberty through tolerance, and he was a major enthusiast for deism. Brilliantly using satire and Candide, here we go, he lashed out at political corruption, religious abuse, the injustice and barbarity of war, and hypocrisy through the eyes of an innocent and optimistic young protagonist. He was the master of the allegory, and to give you an example of sort of how this works, he is basically being extremely critical of French society. But if he gets arrested by, the monarch's police and he gets interrogated, and they say, this book you wrote, Candide, is, you're lashing out at the monarchy, he could claim, well, no, I just wrote a piece of fiction. These people aren't real. These events aren't real. But that's the power of the allegory, that if you want to criticize something, but there's a consequence to that, you can do it through storytelling. We saw it happen during the McCarthy period in the 50s. People were reading The Crucible, a classic play written about the 1600 witch hunts, which was very much a metaphor or an allegory of the McCarthy witch hunts. Inherit the Wind, another great piece of work written in the 1950s, which was an allegory about the harsh realities of McCarthyism as well, even though it had nothing to do with it. So writing critical statements about your government through other characters and through allegory and metaphor is a very, very powerful tool, because people understand, people that are literate enough to read generally could pick up on the metaphor. So Rousseau was the most radical and controversial writer of the Enlightenment. He suffered great poverty in his youth and would relinquish his 5 children to foundling homes. Okay, now we have to pause here for a second. Can you imagine the impact that would have had on him, that he at one point in his life was so poor that he had to give up his own children for adoption? Foundling homes were like an orphanage, right? And this happened constantly, where people simply couldn't care for their own children. And even more tragically, in some cases, particularly in peasant societies where society was even more challenging, people felt forced to actually drown their own children, kind of like in the old days when people would drown cats because they had a litter of 20 cats and they had nowhere to get rid of 19 because they were only keeping one. It's tragic and distressing to think of, but that was the harsh realities of life in which people lived at the time. He favored impulse and spontaneity over rationalism and saw private property at the root of all bondage. Interesting. He favored impulse and spontaneity. Private property introduced elements of inequality resulting in hardship and misery of those denied property. Okay, let's go back to this. The idea of impulse and spontaneity. So he believed this. Don't micromanage kids so much. Just let them go in the yard, let them discover. Let them look at the flowers. Let them build forts. Let them play tag. Let them resolve their own conflicts. In the same way that Locke said that we become, tabula rasa, we become who we are based on our sensory experience, in a way this kind of complements that. The idea that, that the more we are allowed to learn through our environment, spontaneously, that's good for our creativity, that's good for our independence, all those things. So it's a very interesting thing. He was very, very much opposed to the idea of private property. While he didn't necessarily give a solution for it, you can see how someone like Marx later in 1848, in his diatribe, the Communist Manifesto, and later Das Kapital, we'll talk about that in another lecture, how he was very much an inspiration for Marx. Marx, of course, felt people like Rousseau and the French Revolution in general simply didn't go far enough, but it was the beginning of something, right? So private property introduced elements of inequality, as I said, resulting in hardship and misery for those denied property. Originated the idea of the noble savage who became corrupted and imprisoned by civilization. Interesting idea. And I think very relevant today, particularly in Canada, where we've really had a great reckoning, if you will, with the treatment of our First Peoples. In Canada, we refer to Aboriginal peoples as First Nations. I believe in the US they still use the term Native Americans. But the idea that the life that people had before they were corrupted by colonialism and imperialism, if you will, I mean, of course, imperialism on a major scale comes a little later, but the idea that, you know, when we came to the New World, there was no shortage of fish or trees or furs or protein through meat. They took what they needed from the landscape. Sure, the tribes warred against each other, but there was no pollution, there was no money, there was no competition. People lived off the land, and I don't mean to simplify this, but it was the idea that there was something very noble about these indigenous people. And when the Europeans came along and we threw in colonialism and imperialism, we dramatically destroyed and disrupted this way of life, right? And it's interesting that Rousseau would recognize that idea that we had inadvertently destroyed something very remarkable in the process, because we claimed that we were bringing civilization to them, when in fact we were destroying their culture. Holding property communally would result in a social contract and reflect the general will of the people. Boy, here we can see socialism is born right out of here, you know, or at least the ideas that Marx would later develop into scientific socialism. In Emile, he encouraged children educated through experiencing nature, void of rigid traditional structure. So once again, the idea of letting children play, let them resolve conflicts, you know. And I really like this because, you know, I always say to my classes, one of the topics we talk about quite a bit is the history of racism and bigotry and all these things. And certainly Canada has no pretty history with that any more than any other Western nation who's got a troubled history with racism and bigotry. But I talk about the idea that, you know, children, you know, you put 5 kids from 5 different races in a room and you throw them a ball, what are they going to do? They're going to discriminate against each other, or they're going to play and kick the ball? Well, they're going to play and kick the ball, because racism is learned. It is not innate. You know, you might be curious about the way another kids look, you know, if they are different colored skin or different shaped face or what have you. They'll be curious and touch you, but they don't feel anger or they don't think less of you as a human being. Curiosity and racism are 2 completely different things. Kids will play together. They will be curious about each other, but they will not innately dislike or have a negative feeling about them. So racism is learned. All right, Adam Smith. Now we're getting into sort of the economic sphere of the Enlightenment. He wrote a definitive work on laissez-faire economics called An Inquiry into the Nature of and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Boy, what a title, and look at that year. Came out the exact same year as the American Revolution. He argued that land and labor produced wealth, including tradesmen, workers, and those engaged in the exchange of services. Okay, Adam Smith recognized a couple of fundamental things, and let me just explain. If a baker becomes very successful in his community because he makes good bread, the baker and his family are going to earn a very substantial living. In addition to that, they are going to provide sustenance to hundreds of people who love his bread, right? Now, Baker A may decide to jack his prices up because he realizes that everyone loves his bread. So he's going to raise the prices. People might mumble every now and again, but nobody's going to stop buying his bread. Unless, of course, another baker comes along and moves across the street and says, I make bread too, and I'm going to make bread a penny a loaf less than you. And that's going to create a lot of anger with Baker A, but hence you have competition. So now, because you have a threat of somebody taking away your business, you want to make a better product, and you want to make it for a better price so that you continue to sell bread, right? Supply and demand and all those things. So those are the things that he recognized, but he really recognized the importance that skilled tradespeople and that labor played in the creation of wealth in society in general. Business must be free from government interference in order to achieve increased production, which in turn contributes to national wealth. Okay, if you micromanage people or limit their ability to make money, you stifle the economy in the long run. So laissez-faire economics is kind of like hands-off, government hands-off, no taxes, no regulations. If they're contributing to society, let them make money, let them sell their products. Don't interfere in the natural laws of supply and demand and income and wealth and all those things, right? So has its common sense. Private property must allow owners to determine their own path to income, and operating out of self-interest will contribute to national wealth. Okay, so coming back to the baker metaphor, if I'm making money, what's stopping me from making as much money as I can? So long as I'm satisfying the market by giving a service to hundreds and hundreds of people who love my bread. That's something to be proud of, right? What a great way to make an income when you are good at something, baking bread, and people love your bread. Well, you couldn't ask for a better situation. Very rewarding. There certainly will be a great deal of pride in the baker, knowing that he's producing something that people really appreciate. And so it's something that Adam Smith really encouraged, that you got a skill, you're a blacksmith and you're good at it, do it. You're a shoemaker and you make good shoes, my gosh, do it, right? Supply, demand, and competition would see the best interests of both producer and consumer produced. So as I'm coming back to the idea that everybody wins, government should oversee defense, they should protection of property, and essential services like education. So, Salon Society. All right, so this is kind of coming back to the idea of what really fueled the Enlightenment and how this happened. So, increased literacy among the upper classes led to greater desire for debate and learning. Social gatherings were held for the express purposes of intellectual discussion. That's what the salons were all about. Well, let's invite Voltaire. Maybe Montesquieu wants to come for a couple of pints and we'll get him talking about levels of government and so on and so forth. Madame Geoffrin, who was well connected to government officials in the upper classes, held salon discussions between 1750 and 1775. Geoffrin's salons were huge in terms of the acceleration of these ideas not only becoming popular, but how these enlightened thinkers began to influence each other directly. She donated 500,000 livres to Diderot, who worked on the encyclopedia, so she was very much inspired by what she was hearing and what they were discussing. And Madame de Stael was the most famous salon host until she fled the Revolution of 1789, but she would later return after the Revolution and sort of in the height of Napoleon's early reign, when there was greater stability, of course, under Napoleon's leadership than there was during the 10-year period after 1789. She would coin the term Romanticism, and we'll talk about Romanticism in another lecture as well. So. Well, we talked about some of the monarchs in Europe. Of course, we referred to Frederick and, oh gosh, who was it? The one in Russia, probably Catherine the Great, of course, who were very much curious about these ideas. Many absolute monarchs enjoyed the intellectual debates presented by the Philosophers, although this did not mean they wanted more democracy. Catherine the Great of Russia corresponded with Voltaire and contributed financial support to the Encyclopedia. She read Beccaria's Of Crime and Punishment, which is a great piece of work as well, and many of the other key philosophers of the time. She did, you know, I mean, I guess with Catherine, she did attempt to reform certain institutions, but they were largely stalled. I mean, anytime, that's one thing we'll learn, particularly when we get to the causes of the French Revolution, of how much the aristocratic classes and the noble classes completely resisted any type of change. You know, and when we get to France, we talk about the desperate need to implement a system of taxation to cover the massive debt you know, of the French monarchy. Nobody was willing to do it. No, you get it from somewhere else. Get it from the peasants, right? So she maintained close connections with the West and was fond of France very much. You know, the Russians had a history of a love for France. I mean, you go to Peter the Great, for example, who would be responsible for the development of the city of St. Petersburg, of course, and the Winter Palace there that he would build, or at least have tradespeople build, although he himself was a builder as well, was very much inspired by the Palace of Versailles. So, while improving cultural life for the wealthy, very little changed for the serfs and the poor. And at the end of the day, they were very much left out of this equation. And even when we get to the French Revolution, that was very much a revolution of the middle classes, if you will, the skilled tradespeople. And it's really not until the birth of Marxism where we begin to see a real emphasis on the poor and particularly the working classes of Europe. All right. Well, there you have it. We're going to leave it at that. So the next lecture you're going to want to watch from this one would be the causes of the French Revolution. And lots of very interesting things coming up in this series as well. So thank you very much for watching, and we shall see you next time. All right, take care.